Good morning, everyone. My name is Deborah Uber, the Education Coordinator for the Embryo Adoption Awareness Center. We are happy to have you all here this morning and very pleased to bring you part 2 of our newest webinar series titled Let's Talk About It. This one is going to be about explaining embryo adoption to close family and friends. Now, before we get started, I want to do a little bit about housekeeping. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation using the questions you submit through the Q&A feature. You may submit your questions at any time during the session, and we will answer as many as possible at the end of the presentation. To ask a question, simply click on the Q&A panel in the lower right-hand portion of your screen. Type your question into the dialog box and click the Send button. If you happen to be in the full screen view, you can click on the question mark icon on the toolbar in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. This will open the Q&A panel on your screen only. When you submit your question, it will be visible to all of the panelists, but not visible to other attendees. We expect the presentation to last approximately 45 minutes with 15 minutes for questions, and we will be distributing a copy of today's presentation and a list of answers to any questions submitted today during the webinar. If you experience any technical difficulties today during the presentation, please contact WebEx Technical Support at 866-229-3239. And just as a reminder, this presentation is being recorded today. So this morning, we will switch over to the panelist slide, and this morning we have Ms. Leah Freeman joining as our presenter. Leah works with the Snowflake's Embryo Adoption Program as the Donor Family Coordinator. She has worked with both adoptive and donating families as they process through all aspects of the program and has helped answer the many questions that come up with this unique way of building your family. So Leah, we are so happy to have you here this morning, and I will go ahead and let you get started.
Yes, thank you for having me. I am really excited about this webinar because we get questions all the time about embryo adoption in general. So a lot of our webinars are focusing on what to do in the process, like building a family profile or having conversations with the donor or adopting family, depending on what side you're on. And so this one I'm excited about because this has a lot to do with the overall picture of embryo adoption and conversations that you're going to naturally have with friends and family. So whether you've been thinking about embryo adoption for a while or this is something that's fairly new, it naturally comes with a lot of questions. And a lot of these questions are things that you had from the very beginning or you might still have, so this webinar is going to answer a lot of those. But that way it's easier to have those conversations with friends and family when those questions naturally arise and you first tell them you're thinking about embryo adoption. And so this is just really to answer that question of how will you answer their questions without feeling pressured about your choice. So the first thing with any type of adoption is it's absolutely vital to have a strong support system. We see this again and again in all of our programs with adoption agencies. So we just recently got back from an adoption conference over in Florida, and that's something that came up again and again and again was just the importance of a support system. So a lot of families, when they're going through embryo adoption, might be hesitant to talk to people about it because it's so new for them, let alone them wanting to talk to friends and family about it. Like, what if they think it's really weird? It's so different than what they normally think of adoption. You know, we have friends that are maybe going through domestic or international adoption. Are they going to see this in the same light? And so because of that, it really is important to have trusted friends and family or coworkers, somebody that you walk with life through that can really support you in this process and is really going to listen to you and listen to your fears and listen to you explain the program. That way they fully understand what you guys are going through. So just answering questions about adoption. I know a lot of families, when they first make that leap from, you know, wanting biological children to, okay, maybe let's look into adoption, especially if they've experienced infertility, is a scary thing. I know a lot of families and a lot of couples we've talked to, it's hard to even just broach that conversation of infertility because you just inevitably get questions like, when are you guys having kids? Why haven't you had kids yet? You know, those questions come from friends and family who mean well, but a lot of times it can be really painful. So the idea of talking to them about adoption, it can be exciting, but it can also be intimidating because you're not sure what questions they're going to have. So we're going to go through a lot of the common questions that we hear adopting families tell us that they get asked, a lot of the ones that we get asked, as well as a lot of the ones for families that have already adopted as they have conversations with friends and family, whether it's adoption or specifically with embryo adoption, those questions that they get over and over and over again that are some of the more common ones. So the first one is, don't you want your own kids? This goes a lot with what we were talking about in the beginning as far as that process being more difficult to broach that topic about infertility, because a lot of people might not have even known that this has been a struggle. And so using the term your own child, they might be meaning well or might not be aware of the pain that that phrase can bring, but it can bring shame a lot of times for our adopting families and for the adopting children. When a family says that, that's implying that these are not your own children, that it's somehow better maybe to have your own biological children, where you've already walked through this process of, we've grieved the idea of, not having a biological child, and, we're looking into embryo adoption, but that phrase can still bring a lot of pain, especially for your adopted children too. So there's absolutely nothing to be ashamed of. What's neat about embryo adoption is that multiple people were involved in your child's story, and they are extra loved, and so you will always be his parents. And having that conversation with families about that, your friends and family about that, and just making them aware that they are just as much a part of your family as a biological child would be, is a conversation that needs to happen, but it's well worth it, because then they're able to understand a little bit more. And so one of the biggest things is, and where that question stems a lot of times, is your family might need some time to process through that loss of a genetic connection. So like we talked about, with you processing through the grief of not being able to have your biological child, a lot of times they haven't gone through that process yet. And so it can be hard because you've already processed through a lot of this, and then going to your family and them saying, well, don't you want your own kids? They have to go through that process now of just changing what their family is going to look, their extended family is going to look like through you. So they might need time to process through that, because they might have had their own dreams for what grandchildren would have looked like, nieces or nephews would have looked like, and so forth. And so some of these questions are definitely, like I said, they're well-meaning, but a lot of times it can hurt, and they're just not aware of which ones are helpful or hurtful. So one of those being, well, having your own children is so special, it's so different, or, oh, have you tried this? There is a number of things that our adopting families have said, their friends and family have said, well, have you tried this, have you tried that? Chances are you've looked into all of your options, and embryo adoption is the one that you are really interested in and you like the idea of for whatever reason, whether it's experiencing pregnancy and being able to have that connection with your child. So one of the other questions, or one of the other responses is, oh, well, we had to wait a long time, for so-and-so to come to, so just be patient. Whereas you might have been waiting either a short amount of time or a long amount of time. Regardless, it's been your decision to look into embryo adoption. Or what about blank? What about this new medical treatment? And that goes along with the same response or question that they would have regarding, oh, well, have you tried this? So they, in this process, might encourage you to renew hope for a biological child, like I said, something that you've likely already processed through. And so that can bring up a lot of questions that you originally had. If you've processed through a lot of it, or think you've processed through a lot of it, and a family member says, oh, well, what about this? What about this? A lot of times it can bring up those same old feelings because they're so deeply rooted. This is something that you might have dreamed of for a long time, and so to have to go through that grieving process again with your family can be very difficult. So some of the questions that you might ask yourself is, well, I love a child that's not biologically connected to me. We have so many families that say, well, what, especially through the educational process as they're going through that educational process for their embryo adoption, they'll say, what if, I have this child and I don't feel a connection, or I have this whole idea built up of what this is going to feel like and it feels different. It's a valid concern. Will the child wish that they had their biological family instead? What's that conversation going to look like? I don't want people to notice that they aren't my own. If I'm walking in the supermarket and my child, because they're adopted, clearly looks different from me, am I able to handle all of the questions that are going to come up, And then what if the child is nothing like me? How are we going to connect? And so those are valid questions that you might have. But the answer a lot of times is just making sure you've gone through that grieving process so that when those questions come from friends and family, you're even more prepared to answer them because you've processed through a lot of it. But it is difficult to help others with these questions when you haven't processed through them yourself. And so we actually do have a webinar called Grieving the Loss of a Genetic Child. We created this webinar because we saw time and time again that families that were calling in were at all different stages of the spectrum regarding that grieving process. We have some families that have called in about embryo adoption that, just found out the day before that they couldn't have a biological child, and they're, highly emotional on the phone. It's a very hard time for them because they're trying to look into their other options while still trying to process the fact that they're not able to have biological children. And we have other families that have experienced it for years and just are now coming to the point where, they're able to go ahead and look into this option. There's no right or wrong way to grieve. Everybody grieves differently, which is what this is about. And so for you, no one knows you better than you know yourself. And so a lot of it, when answering questions to friends and family, is going to have to come from looking inward and seeing where you're at on that spectrum and making sure that you've grieved that loss. That way you can move forward and look into embryo adoption and answer others' questions. So another question that we get a lot, and honestly, personally, I get a lot if I tell people what I do is, oh, well, isn't this the same as in vitro fertilization? So some friends or family may be familiar with IVF, but embryo adoption is going to be a completely different ballpark for them. For some families, that being said, they might not even know what IVF is. I know I've talked to a lot of people that have an idea of IVF or they've heard of IVF, but if they're not in that world, they have a hard time fully understanding what it is from the beginning. So you also might have some family and friends that haven't ever really been involved with IVF or heard about it, and so it might even require you to just give a basic overview of how IVF, the in vitro fertilization process, is done in general. So when you're talking about how it's specifically different than something like donor egg or donor sperm, for embryo adoption, one of the biggest differences is you're matching based on personal preferences for both the donor and the adopter. So that's one of the biggest questions we get is, well, what's the main difference between like a clinic program and embryo adoption? And that's one of the absolute biggest ones is that, we do treat it socially more like an adoption, whereas a lot of clinics it's going to be more of like a donor process where it's more of a medical procedure. And so that's where only basic information is given on the donors, and it's mostly going to be medical. With embryo adoption, you're going to have mutually agreed communications between both families, and with something like donor egg or donor sperm or embryo donation, there's not going to be any ongoing contact with donors. For embryo adoption, your child will know their own story, and once again, with donor egg and donor sperm, there's going to be that minimal information, the more medical information. Genetic siblings also may desire to have contact later with embryo adoption, which is a possibility. And then embryos are not available for purchase within the U.S., but something like eggs and sperm, you can pick and choose and purchase that. So those are the main differences with embryo adoption and donor egg or donor sperm. Another thing that you might want to mention, too, is with IVF, it's a lot of times going to be your own genetic material. With embryo adoption, it's going to be somebody else's genetic material. So I always describe it as, they created these embryos. These embryos are fully fertilized. It's just that I'm going to be the one that's carrying the embryo, and so I describe it kind of like more like surrogacy. But you are parenting the child after they're born. So that's a good way to describe it because they're going to ask that as well regarding it being more similar to a surrogate situation. And so embryo adoption is actually legally mandated through property law. So federally, embryos are property, and so that means that the process is a little bit different than a typical adoption, but it's also different from embryo donation like we talked about. So it's kind of that middle ground. And so it's socially like an adoption where we match families based on their mutual preferences. There is the possibility of ongoing contact. We are a lifelong resource. But then because it is managed by property law, it is a little bit different than adoption, so has different implications. And it is always with the children in focus, and it is so much more than a medical procedure. Another one of the responses that we get is, I could never do that. I heard that the other family will have the opportunity to take the baby back. Well, what if, I have families calling all the time that say, what if we have this child and then the family shows up on our front door and says, well, we're the biological family, can we go ahead and have our baby? Which is understandable. You hear these horror stories on the news about embryo, or not embryo adoptions, but just adoptions in general gone wrong, and a lot of times that can carry over to what people perceive embryo adoption to be like. And rumors can get out of hand. Because we get this question all the time, we want to reassure families that this is just simply not true. A lot of times they're thinking about different states' laws with birth mothers as far as them being able to change their minds after the child is born. This is not the case with embryo adoption. So when you give birth to your embryo adopted child, you are actually the child's legal parent at the time of birth, and your name is placed directly on the birth certificate. So for all intents and purposes, you are the full parent from the very beginning. You actually don't have to have it even finalized in court, because it's that way from the beginning because of that property law. One of the other questions people are very surprised at is, well, are you going to keep up to date with the donors? Like, do you really want another family telling you how to raise your kids? That's a big concern. And there are some misconceptions about openness. That's one of the questions that we get all the time is, well, what kind of contact would I have if it's an embryo adoption versus an embryo donation? And the best answer is it's really on a spectrum. You can say what you're comfortable with. We definitely do see about, I'd say 98 to 99% of embryo adoptions have some level of openness, which some people are really shocked about, and your friends and family might be shocked about because their perception about adoption might be a more closed model. But we found that openness really is incredibly beneficial, both for the children, for you to be able to process with others, for them to be able to have that story. So some misconceptions are that the donors can contact you whenever or wherever. Because we're an adoption agency and a lot of the embryo adoption programs are based off of the adoption model, the donors cannot just contact you out of the blue unless you've already given your consent. So if you have direct contact, like direct emails or phone calls, a lot of times that's because trust has already been built. And so that means that it usually starts off a little bit smaller and then gets more and more comfortable as everyone gets more comfortable. So for example, at first it might just be an email sent with the agency or through the agency to the other party back and forth. And then as both families start to get more comfortable, then it starts to be more open. So donating families will expect you to parent exactly like them. Right now, I specifically work mostly with the donor families, and I can't tell you how many times they have told me, well, we really, really, really don't want the adopting family to think that we're trying to step on any toes or tell them what to do, almost to the point that sometimes they're like, we don't have to have contact if that means that, they're going to feel uncomfortable. And I have to tell them, no, a lot of times, adopting families are going through the program is because there is that option of contact. And so I would say absolutely most of the families that I've worked with on the donor side have always said that, they really, really want to make sure that the family knows that this is their, adopted child and their full child, and they're not going to want to step on any toes and tell you how to parent. One of the other misconceptions is, they'll want to take their baby and may even take action to do so. I have never heard of any of this happening where a family has even tried to do this, and if they did, they just wouldn't have a legal leg to stand on because, like I said, your name is written on the birth certificate from the very beginning. There's just no chance of this happening. Everything is written in the contract. It's managed by property law. You are technically the owners of those embryos and the subsequent children from the embryos. And then, or they might want to stay in contact for selfish reasons. A lot of times the donors have processed through a lot of this process in general. We have some families that have waited quite some time to go through embryo adoption to place their embryos because they want to make sure that this is the option that they want, that they're not going to try to step on any toes, that they're not wanting more contact and having a really hard emotional time seeing photos or updates. Obviously, it's just an emotional experience in general, but they've gone through a lot of either personal counseling or talking to us or just to go through the program and make sure that they're ready to place their embryos with another couple. So a lot of the differences between birth mothers and donor families, because this is one of the biggest questions we get, especially in regards to openness. Some of the differences are, a birth mother is facing an unexpected pregnancy. This isn't something that she planned. She's often working towards a career or she's in school. So these are, these could be women that are in their teens, 20s, 30s, 40s. I mean, it's really across the board. But either way, they're facing this unexpected pregnancy and are choosing an adoption option for their child. This is often because they know that they're unable to provide a stable home environment for their child, and they might choose to parent if she was able to provide stability, and they may not know how to ask for emotional support from an agency. They're really caught in this and are trying to make the best decision for their child, but it really just does look different than an embryo donor family. For example, on the other side, where a donor family intentionally created embryos to build their family. This could not be more planned. The families are going through a lot to create these embryos, and so a lot of thought went into this. A lot of times they are more established in their career and life just because IVF does financially take a lot. And so if families are able to afford IVF, they're usually very stable and moving forward and wanting to build their family. They have parented already, and they're donating from their completed family. So usually the only reason why they're placing their embryos is because their family is already complete. Very rarely is there a family that is placing embryos that has not completed their family, and in that case it's usually been because of severe health concerns, and they just really know that they're not going to be able to carry any more children or have any more children through their frozen embryos. And so when families call us, I would say 99% of the time it's because they've used, the embryos that they've wanted to use, they have the family that they've always dreamed of, and now they want to give back to an adopting family because they know they're not going to use their remaining embryos. They are more likely to request emotional support from the agency and their family, just because usually, like I said, when they look into this option, they've thought a lot about it already. And so they're going to be calling embryo adoption programs and looking at all of their options because they want to make the best decision. And they already have the number of children that they want. So those are some of the differences. So through embryo adoption, you can expect a mutually comfortable level of contact with the donor family because, like I said, both sides do agree on what they're comfortable with. They have received counseling about their choice. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had where they've had a lot of questions about how embryo adoption works. This isn't just well, I'm just donating these embryos and I want to forget about it. This is a very well thought out decision of we want to give this option to another family and we want to make sure that we're in an emotionally great place to be able to do so. And then, and then they do tend to lead more established, secure lives. So another question is, will the other family want to meet us? And this has a lot to do with that openness component, which is where a lot of the questions are founded. So the family might, but like I said, it will depend entirely on your family's comfort level for meeting them. Like I said, they are really cognizant of maybe the adopting family's fears going into this, and that the adopting family has had to go through the grief process of maybe not having their own biological children. And so that's really going to depend on the relationship that's built between your family and their family over time. Because they are more comfortable and they are wanting to really take the adopting family's lead on it, you can be sure that whether you want more openness or less openness, the family or there is just going to be a family that's chosen based on you having that mutual comfortability. So your extended family may want to know if they should include the genetic family in holiday cards or events. This is a huge question because they're just trying to figure out how this is going to work, with their changed perception of what their family looks like. Okay, well, now we have this adopted child. You might have siblings that have kids that are biological. How is this going to work regarding involving them on holiday cards or events? So having that clarity and expectations from the beginning is important as the relationship grows. For semi-open or semi-closed, contact with the extended family is less likely, and so really it's just going to be that contact between the two immediate parties. And for the extended family, it's just not going to be as, as necessary unless one party does want to reach out. So the genetic family may just want to hear about extended family or see a picture. A lot of times they're not going to necessarily say, oh, we'd really love to talk to your parents, or, usually they see that a lot in the family profile, because that's one of the things that the adopting families talk about in the family profile is, extended family, their support system. So usually they're just comfortable knowing that you do have that support system without needing the contact with them. So then answering questions about embryo adoption specifically, just because sometimes it's more on the medical side. So sometimes families just want to know how this works in general. I know, like I said, when I tell people what I do, I can see their wheels turning, and there's so many questions that they didn't even know they had about the medical side of it, because it's such a new concept to so many people. So one of the questions is, will they look like us? Oh, well, if you're carrying this pregnancy, is there any aspect of your DNA, that's going to carry over to the child? How is that going to work? And I love this. So yes and no, right? So something that you can say is, well, yes, they will have 2 ears and 10 toes just like us, but they might have different hair or eyes, or they might be a different skin tone. They might be a different ethnicity. They're not going to look like mommy or daddy exactly, but we will love them just the same. And this really works. I mean, it's obviously more for, like, let's say you have a biological child already and they have questions. This could definitely work for them. But in some ways, it really does work for adult family and friends too, regarding, well, yes, they are my child, but at the same time, they are going to look different because it is an adoption. So this question may come from multiple family members, and so the key is to keep things simple. And so there's a really handy chart here. You have the egg and sperm that does fertilize into an embryo. The embryos are then frozen and in a tank, which is then shipped to the adopting family's clinic, where you receive it, you have the transfer, and then hopefully a pregnancy occurs. And so laying out that whole process of how it works really answers a lot of the questions from the beginning. That way they know exactly what to expect. And that way along the process, as you're going through the inquiry process and as you're applying and as you're in matching with a family and you're waiting for the embryos to get shipped, if they're informed about the process from the very beginning, then they can support you through every single stage of that process. One of the other questions is, can the embryos get frostbite? Is that going to be something that you would have to worry about? I know that the Snowflakes program in particular just celebrated a baby born that was frozen for over 17 years. And so that's a question that comes up a lot is, well, aren't there any health concerns with that, with embryos being frozen for quite some time? And the reason we feel comfortable is because there is actually no evidence that length of time frozen impacts the embryos in any way. Clearly, this little one was born completely happy and healthy, and I know embryo adoption programs consistently have children born that were frozen for quite some time. And so it is important to note that damage can occur during freezing. So let's say the embryos were frozen in 2002. Back in 2002, when they vitrified the embryos or they froze the embryos, there may have been damage done, and so then when they thaw out, it doesn't result in a viable embryo. But if it was a healthy embryo that was frozen and nothing occurred during the freezing process, there really isn't a health concern to the embryo at all, and there's no shelf life on embryos. I think it's in the U.S., a child that was frozen the longest as an embryo, I think it was something like 19 or 20 years. So, yeah, there really hasn't been any long-term evidence. So another question is, are there just warehouses full of embryos somewhere waiting to be adopted? So I know before I knew about embryo adoption years ago, I just pictured this giant warehouse with all of these embryos, kind of like the Matrix with all of those pods, and that was the picture that I had in my mind. And while, yes, there are over 600,000 embryos in cryostorage in the U.S., only a percentage of those will be made available for reproduction. And so the rest may simply stay in storage, they might be discarded, or they might be used for family building. So since, as you can imagine, embryos are so small, they're able to be frozen in lots of different straws in a tank. So even if there's thousands and thousands of embryos, you're really only looking at a small storage area. So that perception to get that accurate. But then also, like I said, really wanting to focus on the gravity reality of the situation that there are well over 600,000, and that embryo adoption is helping to alleviate that number being cryopreserved in the U.S., while also understanding that if you enter an embryo adoption program, it's not like there are 600,000 embryos that you could possibly be matched with. There's just going to be that small amount that's going to be donated. So it does take time for a family to come to the point of placing their embryos with another family. So this is like what we were talking about with the genetic families, really just wanting to make sure that they have processed this decision, that this is the decision that they know is best for their family. So they're a lot of times going to get counseling from a doctor or an agency before they decide what's best for their family and embryos. I know I talked to one couple that before they even came to me, they had tons of counseling and marital therapy specifically regarding their remaining embryos and wanting to make the best decision. And so they came into this fully prepared. I know a lot of other families have talked to their support systems about it. If they've chosen not to talk to their support systems about it, they're definitely unified between the two of them and just knowing that this is the right decision for them. So it looks different for each family, but a lot of thought definitely goes into this decision. So why would you tell the child that they were adopted? Why not just pretend it's your own? I know I had one family one time because of a cultural background. It was very shameful not to be able to have biological children. And so they were wondering if they could just choose the ethnicity of the embryos, but not just the ethnicity, because you are able to do that, but even more so just a family that looked exactly like them so that they could have the child and then not tell friends and family that they were adopted. The reason why this is difficult is because a lot of times this question is coming from a genuine concern about future children feeling left out, especially if there are biological children either in your family or in your siblings' families. That question is going to come up because, well, why don't you just not say anything and then they'll just be grouped in with everyone else? But the reason this should be addressed is so that they can feel confident about what they should or should not be saying to your children. So from the very beginning, having that conversation with your extended family about things to say or to not say, that way the child knows from the very beginning that there is no shame in that, because that can so easily come. And everything always comes out. I know a lot of families will say, you know, well, what if we just don't tell them? And I will say that we've had so many families where they were not planning on, let's say it's a donor family, and they weren't planning on telling their children they were conceived using donor egg or donor sperm. It always comes out something, you know, if a family member says something or the child figures it out. And so we just find that, like I said, just openness from the beginning is so important. So while their adoption story won't be shared with everyone they meet, it shouldn't be a secret to them. So they might not be walking up and down the aisles of the grocery store saying, I'm adopted or I'm a snowflake, although that might be the case. And we have had some families say that their kids are very open about it with classmates, which I'm sure brings a lot of questions from the teachers that are in that classroom. That way they have the knowledge to choose their story and when to share. There were so many amazing people involved in their story, and so this is a really, it can be definitely a source of pride for them in knowing that they are loved by so many people. And they're naturally going to be very curious. They're going to have a lot of questions for you, and you want to be able to help them understand the incredible way that they came to your family. And then one of the questions, this is one of the best ones to get, is how can I help? So a lot of times they just don't know how to help, and they want to support you, but they just don't know what to say when they're asked, or what's appropriate, or what you're comfortable with, or where you guys are at on your journey. So there may be a few things that they can do to help. I know a lot of times if you might get that question, it's like, well, where do I begin? I'm kind of going through this emotional process of now experiencing pregnancy, or even before that going through the matching process and choosing an embryo adoption program. And one of the biggest things is just providing that emotional support to help you through the ups and downs of the process. You want a person to be normal with and have fun with. If you're nervous about, you know, a transfer coming up, or you have questions, or you just want to talk to somebody, you just want to be able to have somebody that you can be normal with and have fun. If you already have kids, you may need someone who can babysit during the transfers and the appointments, especially if those transfers are further away. Financial assistance is always amazing. We have so many families that, have had friends and families rally behind them and really choose to be a financial part of their embryo adoption journey. And then if there's a new baby in the family, just normal help with, dinners and planning baby showers and really just being a part of that exciting time. So once your friends and family have had time to address their concerns and ask questions, then they can get back to the business of being excited for the newest addition to your family. So for some families, it's a really ongoing conversation where they're going to have a lot of questions over a longer period of time. I know that, like I said, for some of our families where there is a cultural aspect, where there is a lot of shame in not having a biological child, it's going to take a little bit longer. And that's why you really just want to take advantage of the people that are your strong support systems. That's why the adoption agency model is so good, because you can have those conversations with your social worker, with the people that are walking you through your embryo adoption journey. That way you can talk through a lot of those things. And so then when your family is excited about the process or has questions about the process, you feel better equipped to answer those.
All right, thank you so much, Leah.
Thank you.
I'm going to go ahead and jump back in and open it up for questions. That was really fantastic, by the way. I'm going to switch it over just so I can let everybody know how they can submit questions. And Leah, let me know if you see any questions that came in during the presentation as well. So here's the instructions. You can just go ahead and click on the little question and answer section down there if you have any questions. And we'd love to help with those. And then while you are typing those in, I'm going to let you know about some future events that we have coming up. So next week, Wednesday, July 13th, same time as today, we have Funding Your Embryo Adoption Journey. So that's one of the big questions that we also see families, especially families that have maybe already gone through IVF or just in general wanting to kind of figure out how to be able to afford this process. We are going to go through some specific things that they can look into that will be completely based on embryo adoption as opposed to just adoption in general that any family can really look into. So I would really recommend signing up for that. And then on Wednesday, August 10th, we are going to be presenting the fundamentals of embryo donation and adoption. And this is a webinar that we did a little bit in the past, a little bit back in the past, and just kind of went over an overview. So we're updating it and revamping it and going just through an overview of the beginnings of embryo donation and adoption and covering terminology and all of that. And then I would also recommend that you check out Pathway to Family. It's a great resource to kind of look through embryo adoption and just look through fertility treatments. All of that's going to be involved. We have a brand new version of it that is just coming out, I believe, this week. So I would really recommend checking out that. You can get a free copy at www.pathwaytofamilies.com. So I would just recommend looking into all of those resources. They're really great. And then we'll see if there's any questions coming in. I do see one. Yes. You mentioned damage during freezing. Is there any way to know prior to transferring if the embryo is damaged?
Yeah, usually they can see what, so like for example, if I'm working with donor families and I get their embryology report, I get a summary of all of the embryos that are frozen, I'm able to see what stage they were frozen at and then also what grade they were at before they were frozen and then as they're looking at the frozen embryo. And so usually that grade is able to say where they're at in general, but I don't know if there's a specific, I really just don't think there's a specific way to know if they're going to survive the thawing process beforehand, although we can have a pretty good idea based off of maybe the grade of the embryo, but we've really seen babies result from embryos that were really, really graded low. We've seen them from embryos that were graded really high. So we have a general idea, but as far as specifically knowing which ones are going to survive the thawing process or not, that's going to be a lot trickier.
Mm-hmm. And it's also important to consider, too, that your doctor, whatever doctor you're working with for the embryo adoption process, when you're considering embryos that you might receive, they're also going to be able to review embryology reports and give you advice based on that. So you definitely have some coverage for what we can help with, but then some of it is also kind of, there's just not a way to find out yet.
Absolutely, yeah. They're going to be the the medical professionals that are going to advise you on that.
Mm-hmm.
This is Kimberly, and I'd like to add to that discussion. I'm the director of the Snowflakes program, and the Snowflakes program is really based on the fact that we believe that each and every embryo deserves an opportunity at life. And so when a family is placing their embryos with an adopting family, the expectation is that the adopting family is going to give respect to those embryos and give each and every one of those embryos an opportunity at life. And part of that process is going to be thawing embryos and seeing which embryos survive the thaw. Oftentimes when embryos don't survive the thaw, it is because they have been damaged in the freezing process, because what you're trying to avoid when you're freezing embryos is creating crystal structure, frozen crystals, within the cells of the embryo. And sometimes when that happens, the embryo is damaged to the point where it can't survive the thawing process. But we have also found that embryos are very resilient, and they oftentimes are able to recover from damage that has occurred during the freezing process. So it's important to work with your embryologist when you're thawing embryos, knowing how many embryos that you're going to thaw, how many embryos you're willing to transfer. And there's just a lot of information that you need to process through prior to your frozen embryo transfer.
All right. And I don't see any other new questions coming in. Leah, do you see any besides that one?
I do not. I think that was the only one.
Okay. Well, what I'm going to do, I'll go ahead and close the webinar down, give you guys a little bit of extra time to your day. So I just want to thank you all for attending today. I hope that it was helpful and that you now have some better ideas for how to answer any questions that family or friends or anybody kind of asks you when you're looking into it. And thank you again, Leah, for helping with this.
Absolutely. It was great. My pleasure.
Mm-hmm. All right. Have a great day.